When I married Mark, I believed we were building a life together. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone waves but no one really knows what happens behind closed doors. Mark liked to talk. He liked telling people how hard he worked, how stressful his job was, how everything we had came from his effort. I stayed quiet during those conversations. I always did. At home, I handled almost everything else. Cooking, cleaning, paying attention to the small details that keep a household running. Mark called it helping out. I called it partnership. Over time, though, I noticed how often he reminded me that the house, the car, even the groceries were possible because of him. He never said it angrily. It was worse than that. He said it casually, like a fact that didn't need discussion. When friends came over, Mark would joke about how lucky I was to have so much free time. He'd laugh and say I didn't need to worry about money because he had it covered. People would nod, smile at me, and move on. No one asked what I did. No one thought there was anything to ask. I let that misunderstanding sit there, untouched. The truth was, my days were full. I worked from home, quietly, consistently. My work didn't come with loud phone calls or dramatic complaints. It came with deadlines, responsibility, and years of experience. I liked that it was invisible to Mark. At first, it felt harmless. Later, it felt like armor. Mark slowly changed. He started questioning small purchases I made. He'd ask why I needed new clothes or a better laptop. He'd remind me how expensive things were and how careful we had to be. But we really meant me. He never applied that same care to himself. I noticed how he talked over me, not just with money, but with opinions. Decisions about vacations, family plans, even where we'd spend holidays became things he decided. If I disagreed, he'd say I didn't understand how the real world worked. I stopped arguing. Not because he was right, but because I was tired. There were moments I wanted to speak up, to correct the story he told about our life. But something held me back. Part of me wanted to see how far he'd go believing I had no safety net, no options. I wanted to know who he really was when he thought I depended on him completely. So I stayed quiet. I listened. I watched. I kept my routine steady and my emotions controlled. Mark grew more confident, more careless. He thought he was in charge. He thought I had nowhere to go. What he didn't understand was that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. And sometimes, it's the space you need to finally see the truth about the person you married. From the outside, our marriage looked calm and stable. We had been together for 9 years, living in a quiet suburb in Ohio where nothing ever seemed to change. Our mornings followed the same pattern. Mark left early for work, coffee in hand, confident and focused. I stayed back, keeping the house in order and managing my own schedule. To anyone watching, we looked like a team that had figured life out. Weekends were predictable. Grocery runs, home improvement projects, dinners with neighbors. Mark liked routines because they made him feel in control. He enjoyed being seen as reliable and responsible. People trusted him quickly. They believed him when he spoke, especially when he talked about providing for his family. He carried that role with pride, as if it defined his entire identity. Over time, that pride started shaping our marriage in uncomfortable ways. Decisions that once felt mutual slowly became one-sided. Mark began treating money like his personal territory. Even small discussions turned into explanations I had to give, while he never felt the need to justify himself. He framed it as being careful and practical, but the tone always carried something else, authority. I noticed how he kept score. Who paid for what? Who earned more respect? He would talk about real work and real pressure, always placing himself at the center of it. When I tried to share my thoughts, he brushed them off, saying I didn't see things the way he did. It wasn't said with anger, just confidence, like he had already decided my view mattered less. Our home remained peaceful on the surface. We didn't fight loudly. We didn't create scenes. That made it easy for others to assume everything was fine. Mark liked that image. He liked being admired for holding everything together. The more praise he received, the more distant he became with me. Respect faded quietly. It didn't disappear all at once. It slipped away through jokes, dismissive comments, and decisions made without discussion. Mark still smiled, still played the role of a caring husband, but something was missing. I was no longer his partner. I was someone expected to agree, adapt, and stay grateful. I often wondered when the balance shifted. There was no single moment to point to. It happened gradually, hidden inside everyday life. That made it harder to explain, even to myself. I told myself it was normal. That this was just how long marriages changed. But deep down, I felt the distance growing. The marriage everyone admired was slowly becoming something I barely recognized. And while Mark enjoyed the comfort of that illusion, I was beginning to see how fragile it really was. Before I met Mark, I had already learned how to stand on my own. I worked hard through school, built skills that mattered, and learned how to solve problems without waiting for someone else to step in. Independence wasn't something I chased to prove a point. It was simply how I lived. When I started my career, I chose a path that valued results over attention. I liked working quietly and being judged by the quality of my work, not by how loudly I spoke about it. When I met Mark, I didn't see him as someone I needed to impress or compete with. I saw him as someone I could build a life with. In the beginning, we shared ideas, plans, and dreams. There was no pressure to compare ourselves. We celebrated each other's progress, even when it looked different. That sense of balance made me feel safe. As my work shifted into remote consulting, I became even more private about it. Not because I was hiding something wrong, but because I believed marriage worked better without constant comparison. I didn't think every detail needed to be measured or announced. I trusted that respect didn't depend on numbers or titles. To me, partnership meant supporting each other, not keeping score. I noticed early on that Mark took pride in being seen as the strong one. He liked feeling needed. At first, I thought allowing that space was kindness. I believed that love sometimes meant stepping back so the other person could feel confident. I didn't think that choice would be used against me later. Keeping my work quiet felt natural. My income wasn't a secret, just something I didn't bring into daily conversations. I assumed that trust went both ways. I assumed that if the time ever came when it mattered, we would talk openly and respectfully. I never imagined my silence would turn into a story he'd rewrite in his favor. There were moments when I considered correcting assumptions, especially when others misunderstood my role. Each time, I told myself it wasn't necessary. I didn't want our marriage to become a competition of who mattered more. I believed we were on the same side. Looking back, I realized my quiet wasn't weakness or fear. It was trust. I trusted that love didn't need constant proof. I trusted that my value didn't disappear just because I wasn't announcing it. I trusted that the man I married wouldn't mistake silence for dependence. That trust shaped my choices. It kept me patient longer than I should have been. And it set the stage for everything that came next, even though I didn't yet understand the cost of staying quiet. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and we were at Mark's parents' house for a family gathering. Everyone was chatting in the living room, catching up on work, kids, and weekend plans. I was pouring drinks and quietly listening, as I usually did. Mark was in his element, telling a story about a big deal he had closed at work. People laughed, nodded, and hung on his every word. I smiled politely, feeling like I belonged but not wanting to interrupt. Then, without warning, Mark turned to me with that grin he thought was charming. "You know, Laura here is really lucky," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She doesn't have to worry about money or work. She'd be completely lost without me managing everything." He laughed and waited for everyone else to laugh with him. A few chuckles followed, mostly polite, but the words sank into me like cold water. I laughed along, forcing a smile, pretending it didn't sting. I felt eyes on me, some curious, some sympathetic, but no one really understood. Mark kept talking, oblivious, telling a story about how he saved me from being overwhelmed. Every word felt like a small cut, like he was rewriting my life in front of everyone else. Inside, something broke. I realized that this wasn't just a joke or a passing comment. This was how he saw me, and worse, how he wanted everyone else to see me. It wasn't about money. It was about respect. And for the first time, I understood just how little he valued me. I stayed calm. I poured another drink and smiled at his family as if everything were fine. But my mind raced. I replayed our years together, all the little moments where he had subtly reminded me of my place. The laughter, the jokes, the comments, all of it added up. It wasn't just today. This was the pattern of 9 years, hidden behind smiles and quiet evenings. After the gathering, I retreated to the kitchen, telling myself I had to stay composed. I couldn't let him see how much it hurt. I didn't want to argue in front of family. I didn't even want him to know how aware I was of his condescending tone. I felt a mix of anger, disappointment, and a strange clarity. For the first time, I began to see that I couldn't rely on him for acknowledgement or respect. I had been patient, trusting that our partnership meant equality. That trust had been misplaced. I didn't yet know what I would do, but I knew one thing: the person I married wasn't the person I thought he was, and something had to change. That evening, I made a silent promise to myself. I would no longer shrink to fit his image of me. I would no longer pretend that his assumptions about my life defined me. Something inside had shifted, and from that crack in our perfect image, I began to see the truth clearly. A few weeks after the family gathering, I stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see. Mark had left his laptop open while rushing out the door, and curiosity, or maybe instinct, made me glance at the screen. What I found stopped me cold. There were emails, messages, and spreadsheets detailing financial moves he had made without ever consulting me. Investments, accounts, and money transfers, all planned in secret. At first, I couldn't believe it. I read and reread the documents, trying to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. He had been making decisions about our life, our money, without me knowing. He assumed I wouldn't question him because he thought I depended on him. That assumption stung more than the betrayal itself. Then I found something worse. Messages to a woman I didn't know, written in a tone too intimate for casual friendship. Mark had been sharing pieces of himself with someone else, someone outside of our marriage. I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't just financial control, it was emotional betrayal. The man I trusted, the man I shared my life with, had been hiding a part of himself from me. And the most painful discovery came from his own words. In one message, he admitted he had plans to leave me once he felt financially secure enough, confident that I wouldn't be able to claim anything because, in his mind, I had nothing. He had counted on my silence, my patience, my willingness to be invisible. He had planned my loss and his escape at the same time. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, trying to process it. Every memory of the past months, the small slights, the subtle manipulations, came rushing back. It wasn't just one act, it was a pattern, carefully hidden, that revealed the man I had married wasn't the person I thought he was. I felt anger first, sharp and hot, coursing through me. But that quickly shifted into something colder, something clearer. I realized that reacting in panic or desperation would only play into his hands. I had been underestimated my whole life, and now he had made the fatal mistake of underestimating me in every way that mattered. For the first time, I understood the full picture. Mark's charm, his control, his jokes, they weren't harmless. They were part of a plan, and I had been blind to it because I trusted him. But trust didn't have to mean submission. This betrayal, as painful as it was, showed me something important. I had the knowledge, the resources, and the capability to take control of my own life. That night, I made a silent decision. I wouldn't let him rewrite my life or my value. I wouldn't beg for respect or recognition. I would prepare, quietly and deliberately, to reclaim what was mine and show him that underestimating me had been his biggest mistake. After discovering Mark's betrayal, I didn't rush to confront him. The shock had left me numb, but it also gave me space to think clearly. For years, I had been shrinking, small gestures, careful words, quiet reactions, all to keep the peace, to avoid hurting his ego, to make him feel in control. I realized then how much of myself I had hidden, not because I wanted to, but because I thought it was easier for both of us. I remembered the times I held back opinions, the times I avoided talking about my work, the times I laughed at his jokes even when they hurt. I had tolerated disrespect quietly, hoping that love meant patience. I had explained myself endlessly for small things, justified my choices, and made excuses for his behavior. And for what? To maintain an image of a perfect marriage? To protect someone who didn't see me as equal? The truth hit me hard. I had been bending for someone who didn't appreciate it. I had been polite, accommodating, and careful, all while he made decisions about my life, my money, and my future without ever asking. My silence had been mistaken for weakness, my patience for dependence, and my trust for submission. In that moment, I felt a shift inside me. I understood that I didn't owe him explanations for my worth, my decisions, or my life. I didn't need to justify my accomplishments or defend my independence. Respect wasn't something to beg for. It was something he should have given willingly, and since he hadn't, that was on him, not me. I began to see my own power clearly. I had been underestimated, yes, but that underestimation was a gift. It meant he had never truly understood who I was, and now I had the advantage. I could plan, act, and reclaim control without the weight of his opinions holding me back. For the first time in years, I felt the freedom to act solely in my own interest. I made a silent promise: I would no longer shrink for anyone. I would no longer explain myself to someone who refused to see me. I would no longer apologize for being competent, intelligent, or capable. From now on, my actions would speak louder than words, and my life would no longer be a reflection of his ego. That day, I stopped shrinking. I stopped bending. I stopped asking for the recognition I had already earned. And in that quiet, determined moment, I began to plan the next steps, not out of anger or revenge alone, but out of self-respect, clarity, and the certainty that I deserved better than the life he had tried to control. After deciding I would no longer explain myself, I knew the next step had to be careful and deliberate. I started by organizing everything I had worked for. Important documents, financial records, contracts, and proof of my income, all of it needed to be in order. I made copies, stored them safely, and ensured there was no way Mark could claim ignorance. Every paper, every file became a tool for my independence, a safeguard for my future. I also reached out quietly to professionals I could trust. Financial advisors, legal consultants, and even career mentors helped me understand my options. I didn't involve Mark, didn't ask for permission, and didn't let anyone else know. This was my preparation, private and meticulous. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, I would step forward with certainty, not desperation. At the same time, I worked on detaching emotionally. That was harder than anything else. I had to stop reacting to his behavior, stop letting his words sting, and stop looking for validation from someone who had proven unworthy of it. I reminded myself that his arrogance was part of the act he had been perfecting for years. He believed he held all the power, that I depended entirely on him, and that nothing I did could challenge him. I let him think that. Mark became more careless in his confidence. He bragged, boasted about financial decisions, and flaunted control in ways that used to frustrate me. But now, I watched without engaging. Every show of arrogance, every assumption he made about my dependence, only confirmed what I already knew: he underestimated me completely. In quiet moments, I imagined what life could be like once I no longer needed to protect his ego. I pictured freedom, dignity, and respect, things I hadn't fully felt in years. Each day, I moved a little closer to that reality, not recklessly, but with steady steps. I planned conversations, reviewed options, and ensured that nothing would catch me off guard. While he remained oblivious to my preparation, I felt a growing sense of strength. I was no longer living to maintain an illusion of harmony. I was living to reclaim control, to protect what was mine, and to ensure that the betrayal and disrespect would not define the next chapter of my life. By the time I was ready to act, I had everything in place. Every detail accounted for, every risk minimized, and my heart steady. Mark's confidence remained high, but it no longer affected me. I had built my foundation quietly, patiently, and wisely. And that foundation would carry me through the confrontation to come, not with anger, but with the certainty that I could face him without fear and without compromise. The day finally came when Mark confronted me. He was angry, his voice sharp, demanding explanations for small things I had done and questioning decisions I had quietly made. He threatened divorce, saying I wouldn't last on my own and that he had the upper hand in everything. His confidence was high, just as I expected. I listened quietly, letting him speak, letting him believe he still had control. I didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't react the way I might have in the past. I let the moment stretch, letting his arrogance fill the room completely. It was almost comical, the way he thought he held all the power after years of underestimating me. Then I spoke. Calmly, clearly, without emotion in my voice. I began to explain my own situation, not as a defense, but as a fact. I told him about my income, about the consulting work I had done for years without his knowledge. I revealed the accounts, the investments, and the financial decisions I had made to secure my independence. His expression shifted slowly, disbelief replacing arrogance. He tried to interrupt, tried to argue that I couldn't have done all of that alone, that I must have needed him. I didn't respond. I let the truth speak for itself. Every detail, every document I had prepared, showed him that I had been fully capable of standing on my own, long before he realized it. I also reminded him of the plans I had discovered, the messages, the lies, and the assumptions he had made about my dependence. I told him I had been underestimated, and that his control had never been as complete as he believed. The quiet preparation, the patience, the years of careful work, everything I had done now shifted the balance of power completely. Mark's face changed from anger to shock, and finally, to a kind of helpless realization. For the first time, he could see that he was not in charge. He had misjudged me, misjudged my silence, and misjudged my patience. I didn't need to argue, shout, or beg. The facts alone dismantled the illusion he had built around himself. I ended the confrontation without raising my voice, without threatening him, without gloating. I simply stated the truth and made it clear that I was prepared to live my life on my terms, with or without him. The power dynamic had shifted. He could no longer assume control, no longer dismiss me, and no longer define my worth. Walking out of that conversation, I felt a mix of relief and quiet triumph. I hadn't destroyed him. I had simply claimed what was already mine: respect, independence, and the right to live freely. The years of underestimation had ended, and for the first time, I felt completely in charge of my own life. After I revealed the truth, Mark's world started to unravel. He was furious at first, shouting and trying to regain control, but nothing worked. Every threat he made, every attempt to intimidate me, fell flat. The arrogance that had carried him for years was gone, replaced by disbelief and confusion. He couldn't understand how I had done everything he assumed I couldn't, and the realization shook him more than anything I could have said. I could feel his anger turning into regret, though he would never admit it out loud. He replayed conversations, actions, and decisions in his head, realizing just how wrong he had been. He had built his life on the assumption that I was dependent, that I would never challenge him, and that his betrayal would go unnoticed. Now, he faced the consequences of that miscalculation. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw insults or highlight every mistake he had made. That wasn't my goal. My focus was on myself, my life, and the peace I had earned through years of patience and careful planning. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about hurting him, it was about reclaiming my dignity and showing him through action, not words, that I was no longer under his control. I removed myself from the situations where he expected me to obey or compromise. I didn't argue about the past or relive his betrayals. Instead, I created space between us, quietly taking charge of my own life. Every decision I made, every step I took independently, reminded him that his assumptions had been wrong. He was left with the reality he had built for himself, facing a partner who could thrive without him and a life he could no longer control. Mark's frustration grew as he realized his manipulation and arrogance had failed. He had assumed that my silence meant weakness, but it had only been preparation. The more he tried to assert power, the more powerless he felt. I could see it in his expressions, the tension in his words, the hesitation that replaced his usual certainty. Watching him struggle silently was not satisfying in a cruel way. It was simply a recognition of cause and effect. His actions had consequences, and those consequences were unavoidable. I had taken my life into my own hands, and he could no longer interfere with that reality. By stepping away and refusing to engage in chaos, I regained control. I didn't need to prove anything with anger or confrontation. The real victory was in living my life fully, calmly, and independently while he faced the truth he had ignored for years. In that quiet, I found strength. In his confusion, I found freedom. And in removing myself from his world, I finally understood that power isn't about dominance, it's about owning your own life and refusing to let anyone else dictate your worth. After leaving Mark behind, I finally had space to breathe. The house felt lighter, the quiet comforting rather than lonely. I began rebuilding my life, piece by piece, focusing on things that truly mattered to me, my career, my independence, and my own sense of peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't measuring my choices against someone else's ego or expectations. I invested time in myself. I organized my days around goals I had set long ago but had ignored while trying to maintain a fragile marriage. My work became more than a job, it became a symbol of my capability and determination. I no longer hid my successes. I didn't need approval, validation, or acknowledgement from anyone who had failed to see my worth. As I rebuilt, I reflected on everything I had experienced. Being underestimated by Mark had been painful, yes. It had hurt deeply to have my independence dismissed, my intelligence overlooked, and my patience taken for granted. But in a strange way, that underestimation had also protected me. Because he never suspected my strength, I had been able to prepare quietly, build security, and plan my future without interference. I learned that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the silent decisions, the careful planning, and the refusal to compromise your values for someone else. My revenge wasn't about making Mark suffer, it was about reclaiming myself. It was about proving, most importantly to myself, that I didn't need anyone else's recognition to feel powerful or capable. Life after him wasn't dramatic or chaotic. There were no grand displays of victory or arguments to relive. There was simply peace, clarity, and control over my own choices. I spent time pursuing projects I had dreamed of, reconnecting with friends I had neglected, and enjoying a freedom I hadn't realized I had missed. Each day reinforced the lesson that my worth had never been dependent on anyone else's view of me. I also realized that closure doesn't always come from confrontation. It comes from understanding, accepting, and moving forward. Mark had shown me who he really was, and I had taken that knowledge to create a life where I was never again underestimated or dismissed. I had turned betrayal into empowerment, pain into preparation, and underestimation into a quiet advantage. In the end, my life was mine entirely. I felt a sense of victory that wasn't loud or flashy, it was internal, solid, and enduring. I had survived betrayal, stood my ground, and reclaimed my dignity. And in that calm, self-respecting life, I discovered the strongest form of revenge, living fully, freely, and without fear, proving that being underestimated had hurt me, but it had also saved me.